What if the Cold War turned hot? Imagine this. It's the 1960s. The world holds its breath. Nuclear missiles are armed. Superpowers glare at each other across oceans, ready to strike. But what if someone actually pushed the button? What if the Cold War wasn't cold at all? What if it turned hot? Today, we'll dive deep into one of the most terrifying alternate timelines in human history, the day the Cold War became World War III. Buckle up. What you're about to hear is not science fiction. It's a terrifying reality that almost happened. When we think of the Cold War, we often picture a silent standoff, spies lurking in the shadows, and politicians exchanging harsh words across oceans. But behind those quiet tensions, there were moments when history teetered on the edge of annihilation. Moments where a single decision, a single misunderstanding, could have ignited the greatest war the world has ever known. A war fought not just with bullets and tanks, but with nuclear fire. Let's rewind to one of the first flashpoints, the Berlin blockade of 1948. After World War II, Germany was split into East and West, with Berlin itself divided, deep within Soviet-controlled territory. Tensions soared when Stalin decided to cut off all land and rail access to West Berlin, effectively holding 2 million people hostage behind Soviet lines. The United States and its allies responded not with tanks, but with planes. The Berlin airlift became one of the largest humanitarian efforts in history, with American and British planes delivering food, fuel, and medicine around the clock. But make no mistake, this wasn't a peaceful operation. The skies above Berlin became a game of Russian roulette. Had a single Soviet fighter jet misinterpreted the airlift as an act of aggression and fired a warning shot, or worse, brought down one of those cargo planes, the Cold War would have exploded into World War III right then and there. But Stalin, perhaps not ready to gamble with fate, eventually backed down. Crisis averted, for now. But peace was fleeting. Only a few years later, in 1950, the world was pulled into another confrontation, the Korean War. Here, the Cold War turned hot on a smaller scale. North Korea, backed by China, and the Soviet Union, invaded South Korea, an ally of the United States. What followed was a brutal conflict filled with devastating battles, chemical weapons, and enormous casualties. American and Chinese forces clashed head-on, while Soviet pilots secretly flew combat missions against American aircraft. Had President Truman authorized a strike against Chinese territory, or if Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had sent regular Soviet troops instead of covert support, the Korean Peninsula could have become the first battlefield of a nuclear war. And yet, both sides pulled back from the brink. The war ended in stalemate, the 38th parallel dividing the two Koreas remains today, and the Cold War rumbled on. But perhaps the most terrifying moment of all came in October 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was the closest humanity ever came to global nuclear war. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, in response to American missiles placed in Turkey, secretly deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. coastline. When American spy planes discovered the missile sites, President John F. Kennedy faced the greatest crisis of his presidency. The world watched as the U.S. Navy established a naval blockade, or quarantine, around Cuba, prepared to intercept Soviet ships carrying missile parts. The atmosphere was electric with fear. Citizens built bomb shelters in their backyards. Schools practiced duck and cover drills, though most knew it would offer no protection against a nuclear blast. Then came the most dangerous moment of all. A Soviet submarine, B-59, trapped by American destroyers, lost communication with Moscow. Convinced that war had already broken out, the submarine's captain wanted to launch a nuclear torpedo at the U.S. fleet. Under Soviet protocol, 3 officers had to agree before launching a nuclear weapon. 2 of them did, but one man, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. His calm reasoning stopped the launch and possibly saved the world from destruction. So, how did the Cold War remain cold during these terrifying moments? Was it luck? Caution? Leadership? In truth, it was a little of everything. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were driven by fierce ideologies, capitalism versus communism, but they were also driven by something deeper, the basic instinct to survive. They understood the stakes. Each side knew that launching a nuclear first strike would lead to immediate retaliation, wiping out not only armies, but entire cities. Millions, maybe billions, would die. The planet itself might not survive. Leaders on both sides set aside their pride, if only temporarily, to avoid crossing that final red line. In the end, fear of total annihilation proved stronger than the desire for victory. But let's stop for a second and think. What if things had gone differently? What if, during the Berlin airlift, a Soviet pilot got nervous and fired on an American plane? What if Truman had authorized nuclear strikes on China during the Korean War? What if Vasily Arkhipov wasn't there to stop that torpedo launch? The Cold War was a war fought on the edge of a knife. Time and again, the world came inches from catastrophe, saved only by a few brave souls and a handful of wise decisions. But history isn't always guaranteed to take the peaceful path. In our alternate scenario, someone does make the wrong call. Whether it's a nervous soldier, a misread radar screen, or a leader pushed too far, the Cold War turns hot. And once that first shot is fired, there's no turning back. In the next part, we'll explore exactly how that war would have started, who would fire first, where the battles would erupt, and how fast the world as we know it would unravel. So stay with us, because the next chapter is where the nightmare truly begins. October 1962. In our world, the Cuban Missile Crisis ended in a fragile handshake across oceans. But in this alternate reality, history takes a darker turn. The morning sun rises over the Caribbean, but it brings no peace. An American U-2 spy plane, gliding high above Cuban skies, captures images of Soviet missile sites nearing completion. But today, instead of restraint, fear takes over. A Soviet missile crew, jittery and isolated, mistakes the reconnaissance flight for a prelude to invasion. They fire. The plane is obliterated mid-air. Washington learns of the downed aircraft in minutes. President John F. Kennedy, caught between hawkish generals and his own cautious instincts, faces an impossible choice. Against the backdrop of a nation gripped by terror, he orders targeted airstrikes on the missile sites before they can be armed. Bombers scramble, the Navy tightens its blockade, and the countdown to catastrophe begins. But in Cuba, the Soviet commanders on the ground have been preparing for this moment. Cut off from Moscow, believing that an American invasion is imminent, they activate their last resort. Soviet nuclear missiles, hastily armed and fueled, are launched toward the southeastern United States. In a flash, Florida becomes the first victim of this hot war. Miami, Tampa, and Orlando vanish under blinding flashes of atomic fire, leaving behind only radioactive ruins. Millions perish before sunrise. Back in Washington, chaos reigns. The military's war plans, rehearsed but never truly believed, snap into action. Air Force bombers already circling the Arctic are cleared for nuclear strikes against Soviet territory. Minutes later, mushroom clouds bloom over Moscow, Leningrad, and dozens of strategic targets across the Soviet Union. Entire cities, home to millions, are incinerated in an instant. The leaders who launched the war may already be dead by the time the first bombs fall. But the war doesn't stop there. In Europe, long considered the likely battleground of the Cold War, the nightmare unfolds just as feared. Soviet forces, already stationed in East Germany and Poland, surge westward, crashing through the Fulda Gap. NATO troops, American, British, French, and West German, fight desperately to hold them back. But before ground victories matter, nuclear firestorms rewrite the map. Berlin, the divided heart of Europe, is flattened by tactical nuclear strikes. Then come the strategic weapons. Warsaw is leveled. London, Paris, and Rome, cities that survived 2 world wars, are reduced to radioactive wastelands. In retaliation, British and American submarines launch Polaris missiles from beneath the Atlantic. Soviet cities like Kiev, Minsk, and again Moscow suffer repeated nuclear strikes. It becomes clear there will be no victors. And as Europe burns, the conflict spreads eastward. In Beijing, Chinese leaders, bound by ideological ties to Moscow and viewing the chaos as a chance to shift global power, open a second front. The People's Liberation Army surges into South Korea, overwhelming US and South Korean defenses. American bases in Japan are bombed. Tokyo and Osaka, economic powerhouses of Asia, suffer devastating nuclear strikes from Chinese bombers and Soviet long-range missiles. Taiwan braces for a full-scale invasion, as Southeast Asia fears it will be next. Meanwhile, the Pacific becomes another deadly theater. U.S. aircraft carriers race to protect Japan and the Philippines, but communication breakdowns and nuclear strikes leave command structures paralyzed. Battles rage across the South China Sea and beyond, but without coordination, no side gains clear control. It's war fought in shadows and fire, and in the skies and silos across the globe, the situation spirals further out of control. Early warning systems, stretched beyond their limits, mistake debris clouds and secondary explosions for fresh launches. Commanders, unable to verify whether the other side has been wiped out or regrouping, make the final, irreversible decision: launch everything. Submarines beneath icy oceans release their nuclear payloads. Missile silos in the American Midwest and Soviet Siberia ignite, sending hundreds of intercontinental ballistic missiles arching across the sky. In minutes, the United States and the Soviet Union suffer strike after strike. Cities like New York, Chicago, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and Los Angeles are annihilated. In the Soviet Union, what remains of Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Novosibirsk vanishes in radioactive fire. Secondary blasts hit Canada, Scandinavia, Turkey, and the Middle East. Even neutral nations like Switzerland and Sweden suffer collateral destruction, and it all happens in less than a day. In the first 12 hours of war, over 100 million people are dead. Hospitals are flattened. Governments are vaporized. Transportation networks are shredded beyond recognition. Radiation clouds spread outward, carried by winds that do not care for borders or ideologies. Fallout poisons rivers, fields, and cities far beyond the initial blasts. Famine and disease set in almost immediately, claiming millions more in the days that follow. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this war is its pace. Unlike World War II, which stretched over 6 bloody years, this is not a slow escalation. This is a sprint to annihilation. In our timeline, cooler heads managed to slow the Cold War, giving time for diplomacy, caution, and humanity to prevail. But here, the war explodes with such ferocity that no side can stop it. There is no moment to pause and negotiate. There is no leader left to answer a phone call from the other side. Once the first missiles launch, escalation is automatic, devastating, and final. In bunkers deep beneath the earth, isolated military officials try to maintain order, but information is patchy, contradictory, and often terrifying. Some units, cut off from central command, launch their weapons simply because they believe they are already dead men walking. Others refuse to act, paralyzed by the horror they see unfolding on their monitors. But it's too late. The machines of war, built by decades of paranoia, are doing exactly what they were designed to do: destroy everything. By the end of the first day, modern civilization lies in ruins. Yet this is only the beginning. The power plants are gone, the farms and factories destroyed. The infrastructure of daily life, communications, transport, energy has collapsed. Now the survivors face a world plunged into nuclear winter, starvation, and chaos. And the question that remains is terrifying in its simplicity. Who, if anyone, will be left to rebuild? In the next chapter, we'll explore the catastrophic fallout of this war. Not just the bombs and the fire, but the slow, suffocating death of the environment, the collapse of societies, and what happens to humanity in a world scorched beyond recognition. Stay with us. The nightmare is far from over. The opening shots have fallen silent, but the true horror is only beginning. Nuclear war is not like other wars. Its damage does not end when the bombs stop falling. Instead, it poisons the earth itself, infecting the very air we breathe, the water we drink, and the food we eat. In this world, humanity's survival is no longer a battle between armies. It's a race against nature itself, a nature that has been violently torn apart. In the first days after the bombings, fires rage in cities across the globe. Entire urban centers, New York, Moscow, London, Paris, Beijing, become infernos. Asphalt, plastic, and steel feed uncontrollable firestorms that stretch for miles, releasing billions of tons of smoke and soot into the atmosphere. This is the birth of nuclear winter. The skies darken. Thick clouds of black soot rise high into the stratosphere, blocking out the sun's rays. Across the northern hemisphere, the temperature begins to plummet. Summer crops wither and die under gray, freezing skies. Fields of wheat and corn in the American Midwest, the breadbasket of the world, fail. Rice paddies in Asia produce nothing but mud. Famine spreads faster than any army ever could. Even regions untouched by the blasts, like parts of South America and Africa, feel the sting of sudden winter. Growing seasons shrink to nothing. Herds of livestock die, unable to graze on radioactive grass. The global food supply collapses almost overnight. But hunger is only the beginning. As the fires burn out, radioactive fallout takes their place. Invisible clouds of cesium, iodine, and plutonium drift on the winds, crossing oceans and continents. Rainfall becomes poisoned, washing radiation into rivers and groundwater. Fields become toxic wastelands. Forests die off, unable to withstand the radioactive assault. In cities where people survived the initial blasts, a slower, crueler fate awaits. Radiation sickness sweeps through the population, first nausea and burns, then organ failure, and finally cancer. Hospitals, already destroyed or overwhelmed, offer no help. There is no treatment, only waiting. And while the environment dies, the economy dies with it. Global trade, the lifeblood of the modern world, ceases to exist. With major industrial centers vaporized, manufacturing halts. No cars, no computers, no medicine, no electricity. Oil refineries are gone. Ports are destroyed. The intricate supply chains that connect continents collapse overnight. Even if some factories remain, there are no trucks to carry their goods, no ships to cross oceans, no functioning governments to regulate trade. In this shattered world, currency becomes meaningless. The new economy is ruled by what little food and clean water remain. Famine spreads across the planet like wildfire. In countries like India, Pakistan, and parts of Africa, where millions already lived on the edge of survival, entire populations face extinction. Even in parts of the United States, survivors face empty shelves and barren fields. The days of plenty are over. But perhaps the most chilling question is, who survives? The initial nuclear targets are clear: North America, Europe, the Soviet Union, China, and parts of Japan. These areas are scorched beyond recognition. But far from the primary battlefields, isolated regions of the southern hemisphere might escape direct hits. Rural areas in South America, deep within the Amazon basin, or remote parts of Africa, such as the interior of the Congo or southern Sahara, might avoid the bombs. Australia, distant from the major powers, may find itself one of the last industrialized regions left standing. Yet survival doesn't mean safety. These regions face waves of desperate refugees, millions fleeing the radioactive ruins of the north. Australia's sparse population is suddenly flooded with starving, irradiated survivors. South America, untouched at first, faces collapsing governments as it struggles to feed not only its people, but the incoming waves of the displaced. Disease spreads rapidly in overcrowded refugee camps. Social order breaks down. Nations fracture into feuding warlords, militias, and survivalist enclaves. Even the oceans are no refuge. Fish stocks die off from acid rain and radiation poisoning. The food chains collapse from plankton upward. Without the ocean's natural oxygen production and food source, humanity suffocates both figuratively and literally. In this dark world, political ideologies mean nothing. Capitalism and communism both die on the same radioactive battlefield. National borders dissolve. Alliances crumble. The war that began between superpowers becomes a war against nature. And it is a war humanity is ill-equipped to fight. Perhaps a few isolated communities survive. Tiny villages in the Andes or outposts in the Australian outback. Maybe a handful of bunkers stocked with supplies last for a generation or two. But these fragments of humanity are left on a planet that no longer welcomes them. With agriculture destroyed, fresh water scarce, and sunlight blocked for years, the Earth becomes a hostile wasteland. Survivors, if they endure at all, will live lives more primitive than their ancestors centuries before them. This is not just the death of nations, it is the death of civilization itself. But the story doesn't end here. What happens in the years and decades that follow this global inferno? Can humanity, against all odds, claw its way back from the brink? Or will the scars of nuclear war be so deep, so devastating, that humanity remains broken forever? In the next part, we'll venture into the aftermath, the struggle to rebuild, the fight for survival, and the haunting question of whether we can ever return from the edge of extinction. Stay tuned, because while the bombs may have stopped falling, the true battle for humanity's future is only just beginning. The fires have burned out, the bombs have stopped falling. But the silence that follows is not peace, it is absence. A void where cities once thrived, where families laughed, where nations debated policy and power. In this post-war world, the modern age is dead, buried beneath layers of radioactive ash and human tragedy. The survivors now face a simple, brutal question. How do you rebuild when the world itself has been shattered? In the first few months, survival is all that matters. Governments, the vast, complex machines that once controlled armies, economies, and societies, have crumbled. The presidents, premiers, parliaments, and congresses are either vaporized or isolated, unable to command or communicate. Into that power vacuum step local warlords, armed militias, and survivor groups. Some band together for protection. Others take what they need by force. Cities, where any infrastructure remains, quickly turn into lawless zones. Rural areas, if spared from direct hits and radiation, become fortresses of isolation and fear. In places like the Australian outback, the Amazon basin, or deep parts of sub-Saharan Africa, small communities might remain intact, but even here, survival is precarious. Food is scarce. Water sources, if uncontaminated by fallout, are fiercely protected. Those lucky enough to have stockpiled supplies now find themselves in control. Barter replaces currency. Bullets and bread become more valuable than gold. In this new reality, power belongs not to the politicians or CEOs of the old world, but to those who control food, water, and weapons. Technology, once the shining symbol of human progress, begins to fade. Without global industry, without rare earth minerals from one continent and assembly lines on another, the technological web we once took for granted falls apart. Power plants lie silent. Satellites drift uselessly overhead. Cell phones are nothing but bricks without networks. Even basic technologies, like gasoline engines, become useless as fuel supplies dwindle. Over a generation, the world could slide back to a pre-industrial state. Wood-burning stoves, hand tools, and animal-powered transport. And even where technology might survive, radiation forbids human return. Entire regions of the Earth, North America's heartland, the industrial zones of Europe, the Russian plains, and vast areas of China are blanketed by deadly radiation. These are the new forbidden zones, where nothing human can live for centuries. Some areas will glow in the dark, others will remain silent, empty and still, haunted only by the wind and the crumbling ruins of what was. Nature, paradoxically, begins to reclaim these places. Forests might grow where cities once stood, but they will be silent forests, poisoned at their roots. What of human ideals? Would democracy, human rights, and equality survive such destruction? It's unlikely. In a world where every day is a fight for food and safety, survival trumps ideology. The fragile concepts of liberty and justice falter when people must choose between starving and submitting to a local warlord. Communities turn inward, protecting their own and fearing outsiders. Suspicion, not cooperation, becomes the default. In this dark age, people are less likely to ask, "What is right?" Ni si ai, and more likely to ask, "What keeps us alive until tomorrow?" Science, too, fades from priority. Who will study the stars when they are hidden behind blackened skies? Who will build rockets when fields lie empty of food? The dreams of Mars colonies, artificial intelligence, and medical miracles die in the ash of destroyed laboratories. Instead, the human mind turns towards simpler, desperate questions. How do we grow enough food before winter comes? Where do we find clean water? How do we keep the next raiders from taking what little we have? But despite the overwhelming darkness, there is something stubborn about the human spirit. History shows us that humanity has survived collapse before. After the fall of Rome, Europe entered centuries of chaos, but eventually the Renaissance came. After plagues and wars, new generations rose, learned, and built. In this scorched world, the same might happen, slowly, painfully, but inevitably. Children born after the firestorm would not know the world we lost. They would grow up hearing myths of cities in the sky, machines that spoke to each other across oceans, and nations that once stretched from sea to sea. To them, our present would sound like science fiction, yet, over generations, they might begin to piece together what was lost, relearning agriculture, medicine, and perhaps one day electricity. But their civilization would be shaped by the scars of the past. Nuclear war would be their genesis, their cautionary tale, their original sin. Every decision would be made with the shadow of annihilation in mind. This would not be the internet age, the space age, or even the industrial age. It would be the fallout age, an era defined not by what we create, but by what we lost. An age where survival, not innovation, is the measure of success, where the future isn't about progress, but about endurance. And yet, perhaps, there is hope in endurance. Life, even under the cruelest conditions, finds a way to persist. Grass pushes through cracked asphalt. Birds nest in the ruins of skyscrapers. And human beings, fragile but fierce, may one day rise from the ashes, not to reclaim what was lost, but to build something new, something wiser. But such hope is fragile. It depends on choices made by the survivors in the darkest of times. Will they learn from the mistakes of their ancestors, or will they repeat them? In our next chapter, we'll explore that very question. Why, in our real history, the Cold War never turned hot. What lessons humanity learned on the edge of extinction, and whether those lessons are enough to keep us from making the same mistakes again. Because the Cold War's end wasn't guaranteed, and neither is our future. For all its dangers, for all the missiles built and armies mobilized, the Cold War remained cold. But why? Why did humanity, poised on the knife's edge of annihilation, step back instead of plunging headfirst into the fire? The answer, like so much in history, is a mixture of strategy, fear, human decency, and sheer dumb luck. At the heart of the Cold War was a single terrifying truth: mutually assured destruction, or MAD. Both the United States and the Soviet Union knew that if either side launched its nuclear arsenal, the other would respond with equal force. No matter who fired first, both would lose everything. Cities, families, futures, all gone in the blink of an eye. The logic was brutal but effective. It made war unthinkable because the price was too high for even the most hardened leaders to bear. But deterrence alone wasn't enough. The world came terrifyingly close to disaster more than once. In the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, cool heads on both sides, President John F. Kennedy and Premier Nikita Khrushchev, managed to pull back from the brink. They opened secret channels of communication, negotiating a peaceful withdrawal of missiles from Cuba in exchange for the quiet removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey. This backroom diplomacy saved the world. Communication became critical. In 1963, the Moscow-Washington hotline, the so-called red phone, was established to ensure that in moments of crisis, leaders could talk directly rather than relying on slow, error-prone diplomatic channels. It wasn't used every day, but its existence alone provided reassurance that miscommunications wouldn't spiral into mushroom clouds. Arms control followed. Treaties like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, and Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, helped limit the number of weapons both sides stockpiled. These agreements weren't perfect, but they were a recognition that even rivals could agree on one thing: extinction helps no one. And yet, for all the diplomacy and doctrine, survival sometimes came down to individuals. In 1983, Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov sat before a radar screen that falsely indicated an incoming U.S. nuclear strike. Protocol dictated immediate retaliation. But Petrov, trusting his instincts over his orders, decided not to report the warning as genuine. His calm reasoning may have saved hundreds of millions of lives. Just like Vasily Arkhipov 2 decades earlier, these quiet heroes chose restraint over fear. And in doing so, they preserved the future. But now, over 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, we have to ask, have we really learned the right lessons? Nuclear weapons haven't gone away. Thousands of warheads remain, primed for launch within minutes. Russia and the United States still maintain massive arsenals. New nuclear powers, India, Pakistan, North Korea, have joined the club. And China, long a secondary player in nuclear strategy, is rapidly expanding its capabilities. The world is no less dangerous. It's just quieter. And sometimes, silence is more unsettling than noise. Worse still, new threats have emerged. Today's conflicts aren't only about missiles and bombs. Cyber warfare can shut down power grids, cripple financial markets, or hijack communication systems in seconds. Artificial intelligence systems could one day control battlefield decisions, faster, colder, and possibly less cautious than any human general. The militarization of space opens yet another arena where satellites, the backbone of modern life, could be destroyed in an instant, blinding nations to what's happening below. And unlike the Cold War of the 20th century, today's conflicts aren't just between two powers. The world has become multipolar. China, the United States, Russia, India, and emerging tech powers each have their own ambitions and rivalries. This tangled web of alliances and grudges makes conflict harder to predict and harder to contain. The truth is, the Cold War didn't truly end. It evolved. Instead of massive armies facing each other across the plains of Europe, we now have shadowy cyber attacks, economic coercion, and proxy wars fought through third parties. Instead of missile silos in Kansas or Siberia being the first warning sign, it might be a power outage in New York, a cyber attack on a hospital network, or a satellite suddenly blinking out of existence. The same old fears linger beneath it all. Miscalculation, miscommunication, human error. The same dangerous dance of pride and paranoia. So what's the lesson here? Perhaps the Cold War taught us that our greatest enemy isn't just the rival across the border. It's our own capacity for fear and aggression. But it also showed us our capacity for restraint, dialogue, and compromise. Leaders on both sides, even at their worst, recognized their shared humanity. They understood that no ideology, no victory, no principle was worth the total destruction of civilization. The Cold War was a paradox. It built the most powerful and dangerous weapons in human history, but taught us how to live with them without using them. It pushed us to the edge and made us afraid to fall off. But fear alone isn't a strategy. If we are to avoid a new global conflict, we need more than deterrence. We need trust, communication, cooperation, and yes, sometimes the courage to step back rather than push forward. The world today stands at another crossroads. Technology races ahead faster than our wisdom to control it. Nations build new weapons faster than they build peace. The question is no longer, can we destroy the world? We already know the answer to that. The question is, will we choose not to? Because in the end, History remembers not the bombs we built, but the wars we didn't fight. And now I turn this question over to you. What do you think would have happened if the Cold War had turned hot? Could humanity have survived the fire and the fallout? Or would we have erased ourselves from history in a single terrible day? And more importantly, do you think we're safer now than we were back then? Or is the world still walking a tightrope, just in new, more dangerous ways? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. Do you think we've learned from our past, or are we just one mistake away from repeating it? If you found this video thought-provoking, share it with someone who loves history, alternate realities, or just a good what-if scenario. Let's keep this conversation alive, because sometimes remembering how close we came to disaster is the best way to avoid it in the future. Thank you so much for watching. Stay curious, stay thoughtful, and until next time, take care of each other.